The torches flickered against the cold stone walls of a medieval hall. A council of men sat in silence, their faces stern, their verdict already decided. A young girl trembled before them, violated, shamed, her body torn by violence she never asked for. Her family demanded justice. The man who committed the crime stood behind them, smug, untouched, his family watching carefully. But when the verdict came, it was not his neck that would feel the rope. It was not his body that would suffer the punishment. Instead, the council ordered that a girl from his family would be delivered, a sister, a cousin, sometimes no older than the victim herself. She would be forced into the same fate, raped, enslaved, and discarded. This was justice in an age where women were nothing but the property of men. One woman's pain was answered not with punishment for the guilty, but with the suffering of another innocent girl. It was an era when rape was not repaid with prison, death, or shame for the man who committed it, but with the body of another woman. For more stories like this video and subscribe to our channel, and tell me this in the comments. If you were the judge, what verdict would you have given? I want to see how many of you would have chosen differently than the councils of the past. Long before medieval councils ordered women to pay for the crimes of men, the foundations of this injustice were carved into stone. In the earliest law codes of humanity, women were not individuals with rights but possessions defined by their relation to men: daughters, wives, sisters, mothers. And because they were treated as property, the crimes committed against them were rarely punished by punishing the guilty man. Instead, the value of a woman was calculated and another woman could be handed over in her place. One of the clearest glimpses into this mentality comes from the Code of Hammurabi, carved into basalt nearly 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The code famously declared an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But when it came to women, the principle twisted into something darker. If a man caused harm to another man's daughter, if he violated her, then the guilty man's daughter could be given in exchange, her life destroyed to balance the dishonor. This was justice by proxy. The guilty man walked free, but his innocent daughter bore the punishment. The crime of one man's lust was repaid not with his own suffering, but with the sexual subjugation of another woman. This chilling idea that one woman's rape could be repaid with another woman's rape did not remain confined to Mesopotamia. The same principle echoed in ancient Rome. Roman law gave fathers patria potestas, total authority over their daughters. If a woman was violated, her father had the right to determine the punishment or compensation. And in many cases, compensation meant another woman being offered in exchange, often through forced marriage. Rape was not a crime against the woman herself, but a crime against the man who owned her. In Germanic and Anglo-Saxon tribal law, this logic hardened into the practice of wergild, literally, man price. Every person had a value in gold or cattle, depending on their rank. A freeman killed, his family could demand a set sum, a noble, a higher sum. And for women, the crime of rape was often settled not with punishment of the attacker, but with payment, or with the handing over of another woman. If a man could not afford the price demanded, then his daughter or sister might be given as compensation, forced into the household of the victim's family. The idea was simple and brutal. Women balanced the scales. One woman violated, another given in return. Justice was reduced to an exchange of flesh. And crucially, this was never about protecting women, it was about protecting male honor. The dishonor of having a daughter raped was seen as a stain on the father's name. To cleanse that stain, another family's daughter could be sacrificed. Men negotiated, councils decided, and women were moved like pawns across a chessboard of power and shame. Even the medieval church, which claimed to bring moral law to Europe, absorbed this twisted logic. Church councils in the early Middle Ages debated endlessly whether rape should be punished as a crime against God or as a theft against a family's honor. More often than not, the answer was the latter. The woman's body was not her own, it was property. And when property was damaged, compensation was owed, if not in coin, then in kind, with another woman. This ancient foundation explains the logic we will see repeated in medieval Europe. When a girl was raped, the guilty man was rarely punished. Instead, the dishonor was transferred, erased by the violation of another woman. And so across centuries and cultures, the same principle endured. Rape was not repaid with justice, but with another rape. But what happened when this logic hardened into actual law codes of medieval Europe, where every person had a literal price tag, and a woman's rape could be settled by trading another girl as if she were livestock? In the medieval world, life had a price tag. It was called wergild, the man price. From Anglo-Saxon England to the Frankish kingdoms of Europe, every person, from peasant to noble, was assigned a value. If someone was killed, the killer's family could pay the wergild to avoid a blood feud. A nobleman might be worth hundreds of shillings, a freeman less, a slave almost nothing. But for women, the calculation was different and more dangerous. A woman's worth was tied to her body, her chastity, her ability to produce heirs. To violate her was not seen as a crime against her as a human being, but a crime against her father, husband, or brothers. And so rape was written into these price codes not as violence but as damaged property. The records show chilling detail. In some Anglo-Saxon laws, the rape of a noblewoman required a high payment, but if the guilty man could not pay in silver or cattle, his family had another option. They could hand over one of their own women. Imagine the scene. A young man violates a woman. His family is summoned before a council. They cannot pay the demanded price, and so they look to their daughters and sisters. The council orders that one of them be given away, delivered to the family of the victim. This girl, entirely innocent, becomes a living form of currency. Her fate: forced marriage, sexual servitude, or rape. This was not a rare loophole. It was embedded in the logic of wergild itself. Crimes were debts. Debts had to be paid, and women were part of the payment system. One woman's dishonor balanced by another woman's exploitation. In the Frankish Salic law, one of the most influential codes of the early Middle Ages, the pattern repeats. Women were priced according to their role. A freeborn woman of childbearing age was valued higher than an old widow. Rape demanded compensation, but once again the guilty man himself was rarely harmed. If he or his family lacked wealth, another woman could be traded in his place. This meant that women carried a double burden. Not only could they be raped themselves, but they could also be handed over to atone for another man's lust. Their lives were bargaining chips in a patriarchal marketplace of shame. Even more chilling, in some Germanic customs, the price of rape could be repaid by arranging a forced marriage between the victim and a male of the offender's family. But if that was not acceptable, another girl from the offender's kin would be chosen instead. Justice was not about punishing the man, it was about transferring a woman, sealing the dishonor by handing over another female body. And these weren't isolated cases. Archaeological and legal records across Europe show that in disputes, women were used to patch holes in male honor. The practice of marriage by exchange meant daughters were swapped to settle feuds. And when rape was the cause, it meant that one girl's violation triggered the forced giving of another. This is how deeply ingrained the logic had become. Rape was not a crime to be punished, but a balance to be restored, a balance paid in women. But what if the councils believed the best way to erase a woman's dishonor was not payment, but to force her into the bed of her attacker? What if justice itself meant tying her for life to the very man who destroyed her? In medieval Europe, the law often dressed cruelty in the disguise of order. Nowhere was this clearer than in the way rape was resolved. Instead of punishing the man, courts and councils found another solution, one that kept honor intact but condemned women to a lifetime of torment. The logic was simple and devastating. A raped woman was seen as damaged goods, her chances of marriage diminished, her family's honor stained. To fix this, the law sometimes demanded that the rapist himself marry her. To modern ears, this is unthinkable, but in the medieval world it was considered practical. The man would take responsibility for the dishonor he caused and the family would avoid scandal. But in reality, this was not justice, it was a second violation. A woman who had been assaulted was forced to live in the household of her attacker, to bear his children, to share his bed for life. What began as a single act of violence became an unending sentence. Her trauma was not healed, it was bound to her forever. Even more disturbing were the cases when families refused to give their daughter to the man who had raped her. In those instances, councils sometimes decided that the man's family must provide another woman instead, a sister, a cousin, a daughter, offered as a substitute. One woman's rape was thus repaid with another woman's rape, legitimized under the veil of marriage. These forced unions were rarely about affection or choice. They were transactions, agreed upon by men in whispered councils and sealed at the cost of female suffering. In many European law codes, this principle was written plainly. The Visigothic Code, for example, stated that a man who raped a virgin could escape punishment if he agreed to marry her, with her father's consent. If not, the father could demand another arrangement, often involving another woman from the offender's family. The canon laws of the medieval church often upheld this. Priests argued that marriage healed the crime of rape by transforming illicit sex into lawful union. The victim's body was not a sacred vessel violated, but a resource that could be reclassified through holy vows. To them, the outrage was not the violence itself, but that it occurred outside the sacrament of marriage. The result was devastatingly clear. Women had no voice. Their pain was irrelevant. What mattered was restoring family honor, keeping property intact, and avoiding scandal. And in that system, the rapist walked free, not only free, but now legally bound to his victim, legitimized by law and church alike. This was not just about one culture or one century. From Anglo-Saxon England to medieval Spain, from Frankish councils to canon courts, the solution repeated. Rape could be repaid by binding the woman, or another woman, to her attacker. It is hard to imagine a greater cruelty. The man's crime became her cage, his violence became her life sentence, and the law declared it justice. But what happened when honor feuds escalated, when entire families and clans were drawn into cycles of vengeance? And the only way to stop bloodshed was to trade women as tokens of peace. In medieval Europe, justice was rarely about law alone. It was about honor, and honor was guarded not by courts, but by blood. Families and clans were bound by loyalty, vengeance, and reputation. And when one clan wronged another, the result could be years of violent feuding. Rape, in this world, was not treated as an act of violence against the woman herself, but as a deep insult to her family's honor. It could spark vendettas just as deadly as murder. A father whose daughter had been violated could call on his entire kinship network to take revenge. Brothers, uncles, cousins, all could be drawn into bloodshed. But there was another way. To stop the spiral of vengeance, clans often turned to negotiation, and at the heart of these negotiations were women. One dishonored woman was often repaid by the giving of another. If a man from one clan raped a girl from another, his family might offer up a sister, cousin, or daughter as a form of compensation, sometimes in marriage, sometimes as concubinage, sometimes more brutally, as nothing more than flesh to be used. This was not mercy, it was transaction. We find records of this logic in the Icelandic sagas, where feuds over women's honor often ended with exchanges of brides between clans. One woman's suffering was erased, not by punishing the guilty man, but by forcing another woman into a marriage or sexual bond to balance the scales. In Anglo-Saxon England and early Germanic customs, councils of elders often imposed these terms. To prevent war, the guilty man's family would give up a female relative. It was seen as a fair exchange, one clan's dishonor washed away by another clan's sacrifice. The human cost was terrible. Girls as young as 12, even younger, could be handed over in these settlements. They had no say. They were property of their clan, traded like cattle to buy peace. The pattern was always there. This is what made these systems especially cruel. Rape was repaid with rape, but never to the man who committed it. Instead, the punishment fell on an innocent woman, making her body the stand-in for his crime. The victim, meanwhile, was denied justice. Her suffering was not healed by seeing her attacker punished. It was compounded by watching another woman suffer in her place. One girl's rape was answered not with retribution, but with the suffering of another girl. This cycle created what can only be called double victims. The first woman endured the original violation, the second woman endured the punishment. Both were broken, both silenced, both trapped in a system designed to protect men and preserve honor at their expense. The guilty man, more often than not, walked away. He might even remain in his family's household untouched, while his sister was handed over in his place. In some cases, he gained a wife out of the ordeal. If councils ruled that the victim herself should marry him, what began as a crime became his reward. And through it all, the councils, elders, and priests declared it justice. To them, the balance had been restored. The dishonor had been paid for. But for women, justice had become a cruel joke, a system that multiplied their pain while sparing the men who caused it. In this world, women's suffering was not an accident of the system. It was the system. They were its fuel, its currency, its scapegoats. But what role did the medieval church play in sustaining this cycle? Did it ever challenge these customs? Or did it sanctify them, turning women's suffering into holy law? If there was any power in medieval Europe strong enough to break this cycle of injustice, it was the church. Kings bowed to it, peasants feared it, and law itself was written with its blessing. But when it came to women, and to rape, the church was no savior. Instead, it often became the voice that justified silence. In medieval canon law, rape was rarely treated as violence. It was seen as fornication, a sin of lust, an offense against morality, not against the woman. And sins, the priests believed, could be healed by marriage. If a man raped a girl, many clerics ruled that he could avoid punishment by marrying her. The violence vanished in the eyes of the law the moment vows were spoken. The rape was transformed into sex within marriage, sanctified, erased, legitimized. What was crime one day became duty the next. The victim's body, her will, her trauma, none of it mattered. What mattered was that her dishonor no longer stained her father's house, but was contained under a husband's roof. Her rape was erased by binding her to her rapist. And if marriage was not possible, councils sometimes declared another solution. The offender's family could hand over a female relative to the victim's family. This exchange of women, so common in secular custom, was mirrored by church courts. In practice, the church became a sanctifier of the same logic: rape repaid with rape, dishonor erased by the sacrifice of another woman. Priests often went further. They preached that a woman who was raped but did not resist strongly enough had herself sinned. Some theologians claimed that if she conceived, it was proof she had secretly desired the act. In this way, victims were turned into the guilty and guiltless men into husbands or free men. For women, survival meant silence. To speak out was to risk not only shame but condemnation from the very institution that claimed to guard their souls. In the church's eyes, the sin of sex outside marriage was greater than the violence that forced it. The paradox was brutal. Christianity preached that all souls were equal before God, yet in law and practice, women's bodies were tools of male justice. Their pain was buried under scripture, their voices silenced by priests, their futures bound to the men who hurt them. The councils called it peace, the courts called it justice, the church called it holy, but for women it was survival. Survival in silence, survival in obedience, survival in the shadow of a system designed to use them and discard them. But when this long cycle of silence finally began to break, what legacy did it leave behind? Did Europe ever truly abandon the idea that women could be punished for men's crimes, or do echoes of it still remain today? The medieval councils are gone. The courts that forced women to marry their rapists have crumbled. The priests who turned silence into survival have long since turned to dust, and yet the shadows of that world remain. Because the logic that once ruled those halls was never truly about law. It was about power, and power does not vanish easily. For centuries in Europe, rape was never about punishing the guilty man, it was about preserving male honor. And when honor was the prize, women became the payment. Their bodies were used as bargaining chips, their lives exchanged like currency, their suffering multiplied for the sake of keeping peace between men. One woman raped, another woman handed over. One dishonor erased, another created. It was not justice, it was a cycle of cruelty, a system that punished the innocent twice, while the guilty often walked free. And the echoes of that system can still be heard. Even today, around the world, there are places where rape victims are told to marry their attackers, where families silence their daughters to preserve honor, where the shame of a crime is carried not by the man who committed it, but by the woman who suffered it. The medieval world may feel distant, but its legacy is not dead. It lingers in every system where women's voices are ignored, where their suffering is minimized, where their bodies are treated as tools of justice rather than as human beings. That is why history must be remembered as it was, brutal, unflinching, unforgiving. Because only when we face these truths can we see the patterns that survive, and only when we see them can we finally begin to break them. It was called justice, it was called honor, but for women it was neither. It was an era when rape was repaid with another woman's rape. If you were a judge in that era, would you have followed the councils? Or would you have chosen a different kind of justice? Tell me in the comments. I want to see how history looks through your eyes.